right, I guess we'll start. Hey everybody, welcome to the first Intro to Tech, where I discuss and introduce new technologies, technical or not. And this time we're going to be going over Git and GitHub. But before I do, I have a couple of quick ACM announcements to make here. Oh, whoops, my bad. So first things first, if you're not a member, please sign up. There's a QR code right there or a link if you would like to enter that. But long story short, membership is free. The only condition we have is just attend, we say meetings, but really we mean events, and that doesn't necessarily encompass just meetings. But as long as you attend about 7 meetings, I believe, or 7 or so, you reap the benefits of being a member. So you're entered in giveaways, you'll get a t-shirt at the end of the semester, and we'll have a networking event in the spring, which you will be invited to. Pretty self-explanatory. And if you have not joined our Discord server or know of our social media handles, here they are, just to keep in touch with us. We'll probably update our Discord the most often, but we'll typically check in with our other socials often as well. So last week, we had a presentation from Rowdy Careers, and they kind of introduced themselves as the, I guess, project-focused sub-organization of ACM. So if you are interested in becoming an officer, you may scan the QR code. If not, well, that's okay too, I suppose. But it'll be here for interest, if anyone would like to. I can come back to it in the end, so I'll just skip along for now. And just a couple more upcoming ACM events. So the University Career Center is holding a federal security clearance workshop. That'll be on September 13th, so tomorrow, 12 p.m. to 1. And it's going to be both in person and online. If you're going in person, the room is MPB 5.40. It's the 5th floor. And Coding in Color, another sub-organization of ours, will be having their first general meeting this Thursday, 2 to 3 p.m. Same deal. It'll be so you can either in person or online. The room, I think, is a little TBD. We'll probably post an announcement when we get to that. So some other events, ACM-W has their intro to Java. That'll be on the same day as Coding Colors, so the 15th, 4 to 5 p.m. It'll be hybrid, so in person or online. And ICPC, our competitive programming sub-org, which they discuss data structures and how to solve problems using them. They meet on Sunday, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., and that'll also be hybrid, so you can either come in person or online. And some of our upcoming hackathons, or I guess more short-term events. We have the Rowdy Datathon, which is a datathon hosted or sponsored by the NSA, and you'll be given a problem set. So I would recommend you join that. It's really cool. You get free food, free swag, and you get to network with the NSA. And I would take the opportunity if I were you. So scan a QR code if you're interested. And even then, there'll be NSA people there, so you can stop by, ask questions if you would like. We also have Code Quantum, which is our marginalized gender-focused hackathon, and registrations are still being held. Okay, I'll move on. So, last call. If you would like to sign in, you can do so. If I'm going too quick, I will come back to this at the end, so please do not worry if you have not gotten a sign in yet. But I'll give you guys a second just to do that.
This counts for one of those meeting credits.
Yes, thank you. So someone brought up that this counts for a meeting credit. Yes, so this counts as one entire meeting if you're here, either in person or online. And for those of you, which I know there's several of you, who are in applications programming and are here for extra credit, either online or in person is okay, so long as you sign in through the link. Either is perfectly fine. All right, so I guess everybody's good. And again, I can come back to this at the end if anyone's missing a sign-in. So without further ado, welcome to Introduction to Git and GitHub. And this is for the fall. Yeah. So for a little context, because I think this will give you a greater idea of how Git and GitHub actually work, is what is exactly a version control system? And this is essentially the entire basis of how GitHub works. So a version control system, or abbreviated a VCS, is responsible for keeping track of changes made to files. So if you make a change on one file and then a change on another, the version control system will typically keep track of what changes you have made, what's the difference between two files, so on and so forth. And the big question is, well, why should you even bother with a version control system? Well, they're really good for collaboration since it gives you an idea of who changed what files, how do they change them, and it allows you to collaborate with other people and make sure that your code is up to date, make sure that it's free of bugs, etc. And not to mention, these are industry standard tools. Many employers will want candidates to have at least a basic understanding of how version control systems such as Git, which I'll get to in a minute, work, or GitHub. I know for my internship, I personally use Git, but it was very helpful in collaborating with other people I knew in making software engineering projects. So I highly recommend at least knowing the basics. You don't have to be advanced, but knowing the basics will serve you well. So coming back to why we brought up the version control system talk, Git and GitHub, well, first let's make a distinction. Git and GitHub are not the same thing. Git is a version control system itself, meaning it is what keeps track of changes. Local club of Git where all your files and stuff are stored in the cloud with one service. And essentially, yeah, like I said, Git typically are local to your machine. They don't really affect the cloud unless you tell them to, or unless you give them the change or the signal to do so. And that's through a command, which choose whatever operating system you use. So likely you'll either use Mac or Windows. I recommend you download this because that's exactly what we're going to walk through, or the tools downloaded we're going to use for our tutorial. So first things first, in order to actually make a repository in GitHub, so this is instantiating the cloud repository. First thing we typically do is on your account, or on your account page, if you go to your own profile. In my case, I go to my organization, but just to show you, if I go over to my account or my profile, I can essentially create a new repository through this little big green button. In my case, what I will do is I'll create a repository here, which is an organization. It's kind of very similar to account. Don't worry about the differences. So what I'll do is I'll choose public. I'll give it the same name. I'll just say like ACM, ACM-W Workshop 2022. And I'll just say, this is a nice workshop from Git. And then you can just mostly ignore most of this for now. And we can just make a repository. So now we essentially have created this remote repository on GitHub itself. Now, what we need to do is we need to create a local repository in our machine. So in order to do that, what I would do is I would open up something called Git Bash, which if you download the tools like hinted at earlier, you can find git bash, which will look like this terminal right here. And so essentially what you'll want to do is you will want to go to the directory where you want to create a file. So in my case, I will go to, I believe here, yeah. And then in my case, I've already created a folder for my workshop. Oops. And then, so at the moment, nothing's here. But what I should do, and this is the very first thing I said in the slides, if we go back for a sec here. Yeah. So first thing we have to do is we have to create our local repository, which is simply just done through git init. So in a folder, wherever you've created this directory, you just type git init. And what that does is just it creates an empty Git repository, so a local repository that at the moment has nothing attached to it. So the first thing to do is, if I go back to a slideshow here for a sec, first thing we have to do is we essentially have to add a file. And the way Git knows which files you intend to commit or keep a snapshot of is done through git add file name. So file name being whatever file you would use. So in the case of, so maybe to make things clear, typically in a repository, you have a README file, which is essentially the first set of text anyone will read when they come to your repository. So in our local repository, let's go ahead and create that file first. So what I'll do is I'll just say, I'll just create a file called readme.md. And then I'll give it some text, and I'll say, I don't know, hello, you. So I've given this thing a piece of text. And then, so again, like I said, in order to actually add this and make sure Git knows this is the file I am concerned with in this snapshot, right, we do git add. And we can either do readme.md, because that's some file we modified, right, or we can add dot, which essentially just adds all files you have modified, and we can also check the status of our files. So notice how it says changes to be committed, right? So this is essentially a list of changes that you have modified that will be snapshotted or captured at a particular moment. And in order to actually make some sort of snapshot, you would do git commit and then -m and some message. So the reason we have that -m parameter is typically because it's nice to have some sort of message whenever you make this a snapshot, right? Like if I fixed a bug, it may be useful to tell people, oh, I fixed a bug that does X, Y, and Z. So in general, it's probably really good practice to keep some sort of commit message so people know exactly what you fixed or what you changed inside of code. And so let me see what's next. So here, yeah, so I'll talk about that part in a bit. But essentially what we do is to keep a snapshot, right? I would do the same thing I did, so git commit, and I would give it a message. So I'd say readme.md and added a readme file. So you'll notice that now it tells you that a file has changed, meaning obviously we've created a new readme file, and it's inserted some things. And you can ignore this, but this is basically confirming that, hey, we choose file, we add this file in. So now the question is even though I've showed, hey, look, I modified this local repository, take a look, I think the question is, well, how do I get my changes from my local machine to an instance on the cloud? Or how do I get whatever I've created locally to the repository that's stored on GitHub servers? So in order to do that, we typically use, so first thing, we have to give it a destination, right? So we have to tell that a remote location, in other words, the cloud repository, is actually where we plan to push, or in other words, finalize our changes, right, to this repository. We have to add a location and tell it, look, this is where we intend to keep our changes when we think we're ready to go to a remote repository. And so, like I've said, we gave the repository very simple settings. We ignored most of them. And so, again, Git only knows changes of your local repository. It needs to store, or it needs to know what location to finalize all the changes on the cloud. So you can do it through this command called git remote add origin, and then whatever the link of your repository is. So if we go back to the one I've created, in this case, we can say this thing, right? So this link right here, in my case, it's where it's located, so your username, and then what the name of your repository is. So what I would do is I would take this link, and then I would go back to git bash, and then what I would do is git remote add origin, and then I don't think you have to, so by default, these are typically called main. The branch you have just created is typically called main, so you can basically do this afterwards, but for now, we'll add the destination in. So right now, I've said that that's the origin, and then to actually finalize our changes to the cloud, we do git push hue, and then origin main. And what hue does is it essentially sets the upstream branch. And what I mean by that is it basically tells us, git push. Anytime you call git push, that where you're pushing is going to be on main. So if I do this, oh, I might have missed the links. If I push it here, I might have messed something up. Oh, that's fine. So
I have a quick question. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, please.
For the syntax of like this, I suppose is something similar to what I've seen for Raspberry Pi. Is there like a general like tutorial or something that we can look at? So I get like following this, I guess, example or tutorial right now is like fine and dandy, but like understanding when to use like a push or is there a general syntax tutorial or?
That's a good question. So what someone asked was, when exactly should we use a push, right? Or when is that?
Yeah, I mean, for example, but it just like you're typing everything in, and we're seeing like you're changing file names and things like that. But it's like I guess zero programming experience. Like, what do these things mean, and is it like specific for GitHub, or is this like a normal syntax?
So right, that's a good question. So typically, these commands I'm issuing here, these are normal for Git in its entirety, right? Okay. What I'm basically doing is I'm basically like attempting to try to link, what I've already set here. Like I'm basically trying to establish a link between this copy that I've kept on my local machine of all, the files I wrote and changed, and I'm essentially trying to see how do I link this to some place on the cloud where I would want all my code to be stored there, if that makes sense. Yeah. So let me get back to that. So let's continue on. I'll kind of explain things as we go. Yeah, thank you for the question though. So this is another important slide. So let's say that you've already created a repository and you would like some sort of copy of it on your own machine. You get clone. So let's say, if we go to our old repository here, right? So if, for instance, I'm interested in creating a copy of this, what I can do is I can go back. I'll just say I'll make a folder. So we just do that through make dir. But you can do this through the file explorer. So I'll just say copy of repository. And I think I don't actually have to do this, but just to show you, if I do git clone, this essentially just clones the contents of the repository in here. But of course, you'll see that because it's an empty repository, we haven't actually pushed anything to it yet, it's going to be completely empty. So if you do like this, I think, yeah. Oh yeah, so you'll see that it created a folder with our repository information, and that it's kind of just empty. So kind of like what I'm doing here, we're adding a file. And just do readme.md, and then this is a new repository. So like I said, a readme.md is typically a file, the first file to see when you get to your repository. So if I just do git add readme, meaning we want this change to be essentially taken a snapshot of, right? And then we can do git commit m, and we'll say that, oh, we added in a readme. And then I think we can just do git push u and then origin main. And so now, so I kind of messed up on the last part, but essentially this is what should happen. So typically, you do put this command before to essentially tell it that this is where you would like your changes to be pushed to. And then you would typically just do this command thereafter because that's what the branch, or that's the, sorry, I'm using wrong terminology here. This is essentially the destination you want all your code to be, finalized in. So if I reload this page, you can see that that file I just created and I set as a snapshot, right? I've essentially finalized that push, and I've brought all those pre-existing changes, and now I have them in this code base in the cloud. So if I go back, so these are just some useful techniques to kind of either clone pre-existing repositories you may use or create changes. You had a question?
No, I was going off this question, I wanted to clarify, Git and GitHub are separate entities. Git is a command line tool, whereas GitHub is a host website for GitHub Git repositories.
Exactly, yes. So essentially, Git and GitHub are different. They are distinct. Git is essentially like a version control system on its own, while GitHub is essentially a hosted version of Git, if that makes sense. Yes, question?
Would Git be kind of like to GitHub where like a video would be to YouTube?
I think that's a fair way to say it. Think of it like you have a bunch of video files in your computer, but YouTube is where like there's a bunch of video files shared with everyone. I think that's a suitable analogy.
Yeah, I guess to kind of like re-elaborate on my initial question, I was more so asking about like the Git actions, because I did like a quick, and I guess like there are specific commands that you use frequently in like the built-in library. So I guess I'll just have to take a look at that later.
Yeah, and there's a lot, but for the most part, you'll only use a tiny subset of Git commands. So like add, commit, push, and some other, and clone, which is useful. I'll kind of, I don't know if I'm doing a great job so far, but I'll kind of explain these as I go along. You had a question?
Yeah, so what was the difference between what you did this time where it actually pushed and the last time where it didn't push, right? Like what was wrong, what was missing?
So I think the problem was that I seemed to give it an invalid location. So because I tried to essentially give it a link and say, hey, this is the destination where I would like all my changes to be finalized. When I to begin with. So I didn't need to do git init, because git init is essentially initializing it for the first time. So it assumes that a folder you have has never, there's no .git folder, and usually when you look at your files, there's a hidden folder called git, and that actually is what Git knows that folder is a particular repository, whether or not there's the existence of this folder. But in the case of the newer one, and answering your question, is that because I've cloned a pre-existing repository, it already knew that that was a repository to begin with. I didn't have to initialize and tell a folder was a repository. If that makes sense.
So to set up the push, would I still have to insert the link, like when I'm connecting it to GitHub?
Yes, typically.
Put in the link?
Yes, typically you do have to put a link because because you have to be explicit where your changes are going to be finalized at, if that makes sense. Yeah. So if you're just focused on a local repository, then you don't need to worry about adding a remote location because you're not concerned with having your changes on some other repository that isn't your computer, like a cloud instance, like what this thing was. So yeah, you don't have to worry about it in that scenario. Okay, all good. So kind of what we went over is that typically when you're ready to finalize your changes, you run git push. And so this is like the very tail end when you think, okay, well, all my code looks good, I think it works fine. Here's where I actually put all this into the cloud, right? Or here's where I put this into the, I guess, cloud version of my repository. You would do git push, and that would essentially finalize the changes. And so afterwards, just using git push rather than doing git push to you origin main. The reason this is just doing git push after is sufficient is because it basically already knows by default that this is the branch we're going, or the version that we need to track. I know I throw out the term branch. We're going to discuss what that actually means later on. And so when, let's say somebody else makes changes to that repository I talked about, right? And then you're interested in trying to copy their changes onto your machine, right? So some other person has changes on their local machine, but then they decide to push and finalize all their changes onto this like single cloud repository, right? So what if you want to get their changes back, or the changes that have happened most recently? So you could do this through the git pull command, and what pull does is it basically takes in all those changes and tries to know what files weren't modified, and then updates all your files as they were in that cloud repository. And I know I mentioned working directory state here, but I think it'll make more sense when I talk about it in the next slide. Essentially, this is how the cycle of Git works. Or this is typically the cycle in which you would use Git and GitHub. So typically, you would first make any sort of changes to your code, right? You would add them in as changes you're interested in. So this is essentially like between working and staging area, right? So that's when you would like files to be considered in a snapshot, right? You would do git add. Then when you think you're ready to essentially take a snapshot of these changes, you'd use git commit. And then finally, when you think you are ready to take all the snapshot and finalize it to some other remote repository, you would do git push. And in the reverse, git pull essentially takes in all the changes that someone else has made, so some remote repository or remote code base, right? And it tries to figure out what has changed, what needs to be changed, etc., and then puts it on your machine. So I discussed branches here, and I've thrown the term around. I've said branch quite a few times without really defining it. So what exactly do we mean by branch? So essentially, what a branch is think of it as like a copy of the remote repository, but it's essentially separate from that. So essentially, you're having two copies of the same remote repository, but they're going to go off on their own different changes. So if you change one branch, for instance, that doesn't really affect the other branch. So these two are entirely independent. So you can change. So for example, let's say that you're interested in having one copy of your remote repository for deployment on some sort of web service, but then you're interested in having another copy purely just to make new development changes or just for testing. Then you can do that. You can have one branch that's purely for deployment and one branch that's purely for development. So you can test a bunch of changes without really having to affect the main branch, or in case you actually break anything. So the way you do this is through, well, first you have to create a new branch, which I believe is done through git branch, and then the branch name, so whatever branch name you would like. And then when you are interested in modifying a singular branch, you would do git switch, which is actually a new command to do this. Or you can still use some of the old pre-existing commands, which is perfectly valid, but git switch is a lot clearer and concise in just telling it, okay, I would like to switch to some other branch. And so let me check. So I'll talk about merging in a sec here. So if we go back to our part here, so let's say that, for example, I'm interested in testing thing. If I do git branch, right, and I say branch, and then I can take a look at what branches exist through, I think, all, right? We notice that this new branch thing has appeared here, and this basically tells us that right now we're on main, and this is basically just saying that this is. If we want to switch branches, you can say new branch. And then let's say, for example, we're interested in making some sort of Python script. So what I'll do is I'll just make a really simple program that prints hello world. And I'll save that. And so what I can do is I can what I did last time, where I'm interested in adding the file. So I would do git add main.py, right? And then I would commit, take a snapshot of this, and then do -m, and I'll just say main.py added in script. And then remember, the last thing we do is when we're ready to finalize our changes, we do git push. Or what I should do is git push, right? And so what we have to do is we have to specify the branch name here. In this case, it's new branch. And I can just do that. This is essentially the same thing as saying this entire line. So if I just do git origin new branch, then that is also fine. So if we go back to our repository, load the page, notice how it's, so we can look at branches in GitHub through doing this thing here, clicking this little button here, and you can see that that new branch was automatically created by GitHub. And you'll notice that this branch has that main.py file, but if we go ahead and back to the other branch, it's not the main.py file. So notice how this is essentially sort of a derivative of the original branch, and we've made changes to it, but this hasn't actually affected that other main branch yet. So new branch is based off of main, but it hasn't entirely, but it hasn't modified main yet because it's kind of its own separate copy, so to speak. So now the question is if I am interested in developing an application, right, and I've made all these sorts of changes, they're really cool, etc. The question kind of remains, well, how do I actually get these changes from one branch to another branch? Like, how do I actually, so let's say like I have a bunch of features that I think are completely prepared to deploy somewhere, and I want this on like my main branch where everything is happy and stable, etc. What I can do is I can use a practice called merging. So essentially what merging lets you do is it lets you take two branches and it lets you merge them together. So I think it's easier to illustrate through this diagram here, right? So you have like a series of snapshots or commits, right? And this branch, ISS53, has its own set of commits or own set of snapshots, right? So it is master here. Master has its own set of commits. However, when we start to merge them, we'll notice that they come together, and you notice that this snapshot is essentially the ISS53 branch merged into master. So all the changes done here are now kind of merged into this commit here, or the snapshot. And so in order to actually merge two branches, right, we can run the git merge and then the modified branch. So if I go back here and let's say I switch my branches to my main branch, right? So same practice as we did. And then let's say we're interested. So what we can do in merging the two branches, I can say git merged, and I can say new branch. And so what I can do is I believe I can do git commit, I think. Or actually, I think that does it by default. I don't have to git commit. If I go back, my bad. If I go back, I think I might have to actually push. Yes, I do have to push. OK. So if I do git push, you'll see that now this main branch has the same changes as this new branch. And so I didn't need to commit anything because it basically just did most of that for me. All I had to do was push it to make sure that the changes are in my local repository were the same as the remote. And so typically, when you're working with other people, you won't really be able to just merge your changes. Instead, what most features like, or rather services like GitHub or alternatives to GitHub, like you may have heard like GitLab or Bitbucket, typically what they do is they have this feature called a pull request. And essentially what a pull request allows you to do is it allows you to open up a series of changes for discussion. So before you start to merge two branches together, you basically get to open up some sort of thread and discuss with people, well, why do I want this change? Why do I want to put these features in, etc. So Again, this is typically not a feature in Git itself, but rather services like GitHub or GitLab, so on and so forth. So to kind of illustrate the idea of a pull request, what I can do is I can, let's say I modify the file I had, right? And then let's say, I don't know, let's say I'm interested in printing another statement. So this is another statement, right? Oops. And so I'll save the file. And so like what I would do last time is I would just do git add dot, or I can do git add main.py, basically saying that I'm interested in adding the file just modified. And you can check the status of your current commit or current snapshot by doing git status. And so you can see what changes are going to be committed or going to be snapshotted. In this case, just the file I've specified. And if I do git commit, so again, taking the actual snapshot, and I can say main.py, added a new print statement. And then again, in order to actually finalize our changes to the remote repository, we would do git push, which actually, yeah, I can probably do that. Or actually, this is a great point. So in case I actually mess up anything in these commits, what I can do is I can actually do git reset, and I believe I can do. And what this does is it basically, so that's a great point. So I actually made a mistake right there. And so let's say you've already created a snapshot, but you kind of made a mistake. Before you can actually, before you push these changes, what you can do is you can do git reset, and reset will essentially reset your changes to a specified commit or snapshot. In this case, the reason I use this head -1 is basically I'm saying that I want all of my files to be in the state that it was before I've committed it. So I essentially set it, rather than the current commit, to one commit ago. So if I look at main.py now, which, I think that's because of that. Well, so what I can do is, I'll just push my changes. So I'll just say that. And it looks like it's up to date. So now, actually, yeah, so now I believe main is actually up to date. And so if I go back here, I'll show you guys in a bit. Refresh this page. What I can do is, let's say that, yes, this one's up to date, and this one I've updated, I think. So so I would like to show pull requests. So let's say I add another statement. So, and then save that. And then let's say I switch my branches. So again, I'm interested in a new branch. And so we can look at those sets of changes, right? What I can do, so right now I've changed these files. And so I can do git add what I've added. And then I can do commit. And I'll say read me md. Added another print statement. And then again, I would push to finalize my changes, or rather git push origin new branch, because again, I have to specify, because last time I did main, now I have to re-specify it anytime I change my branch, right? And so this one now has to change, but notice how GitHub will tell you that this is actually one commit or one snapshot ahead, right? Because this one has that statement, main does not. If I go back here, you'll see that it had new changes. So now the option, so GitHub actually gives you a suggestion to make a pull request, right? So if I'm interested in doing so, the title is just automatically named whatever the commit was, and it basically checks if you're able to merge it, and you actually can look at changes. But for now, I'll say, yes, I'm interested in changing this branch. And so what I can do is I can create the pull request. And so typically, you would have people discussing what kind of changes should and shouldn't be allowed, and so on and so forth. So you can obviously have replies. But let's say everyone approves. What we can do is we can do merge pull request, and we can confirm the merge. And now, if we go back to our actual code, you'll see that now this is up to date, and you'll see that this line has now been added, because we've essentially done the same thing as git merge, except there's a bit of an extra step involved. where basically approve that these changes are indeed what we would like. So if I go back, and there's essentially that comment there. This is basically just an example of what you would typically see when you do a pull request. And so I think that pretty much covers it for most of the meeting. Are there any questions? Because I know I wasn't terribly clear on some of the stuff.
Did you clarify what doing get add with period does?
That's a good point. I may have mentioned it, but I guess I'll go ahead and mention it again. So whenever you do the command git add and dot, that essentially takes all the recently modified files, and that tells Git that you want any file that has been recently modified within the last. So anything that's different from your previous snapshot or commit, right? You essentially want to add those changes into the stage or stage for commit. In other words, you want those changes to be snapshotted. So git add dot basically just makes any modified file, any recently modified file, a part of your commit when you actually do git commit and whatever you would like. Any other questions? Yes.
Could you quickly go over the pull requests one more time?
Sure. Thank you. I'll clarify that. So
Did you talk about this on get pull?
I did not, and in fact, we can actually go over that. Actually, this is a good opportunity to talk about git pull. I did talk about it briefly, but so first question. So about git requests or pull requests rather. So pull requests are very similar to what merges are, except instead of like automatically approving changes with a git merge, like essentially a git merge like forcefully does it, a pull request, when you open a pull request on a service like Git or GitHub, and in this case it's closed because I've actually already merged changes or approved the changes, typically you have like changes you would like for one branch to take from the other. So in this case, this main branch, if we'll go back here, so in this case, this new branch had changes, right? But then we wanted to add those changes into our main branch, right? So what we did is we essentially created a pull request for someone to discuss or approve, right? And we wanted to say, okay, well, this is why typically in here we would say, this is why I think my changes should be added to other branch. And after some discussion or whatever, it's kind of like a forum. You would either approve or not approve the changes. And what you would do, well, what ends up happening is that all the changes from new branch would essentially get merged into this main branch. And we say main in this case because that's the branch where we would like our changes to actually align with what new branch has, if that makes sense.
Is there a command line statement for that, or is this all just done through GitHub?
That actually is a pretty good question. I don't think there may be a command line statement. Like I don't think, for example, I don't think git pull request works. Yeah, I don't like this doesn't typically work, and the reason for that is because pull requests are typically a service, or they're typically handled by a service itself, not the Git tool, because Git is kind of a separate tool from Git and GitHub. But providers will typically have some sort of way to do pull requests. I think they are called the same thing in like a service like GitLab or Bitbucket. Like I think they're called the same thing. Does anybody else have any questions? Does that answer your question? Okay. Any questions? No? Okay. Well, signing in. I'll leave that for a little longer. And with that being said, thank you for coming today. Oops. Yeah, sure. I'm sorry. I don't know if I was terribly clear. Oh. We're going to talk about poll, but it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, no, so, yeah, so I saw you in like RAS. Are you doing like ACM RAS and that? Or?
Oh,